June 13th, 1944. 8 in the morning. The Norman town of Villiers-Bocage dozed in the early morning sun, its cobblestone streets still wet with dew. The locals had already fled, leaving behind shuttered windows and empty cafes. The war that had liberated them days earlier was about to transform their town into a killing ground. Lieutenant Colonel Viscount Cranley, commanding the 4th County of London Yeomanry, sat in the turret of his Cromwell tank as his column rolled into the town's main street. Behind him stretched the pride of British armoured warfare, 25 tanks, half-tracks and supporting vehicles of the 7th Armoured Division, the famous desert rats who had fought Rommel to a standstill in North Africa. They were the spearhead of Operation Perch, an ambitious flanking manoeuvre designed to encircle German forces and capture the strategic city of Caen. The plan was elegant. While American forces pushed west and British infantry fixed German positions frontally, the 7th Armoured would slip through a gap in German lines and drive deep into enemy territory. Intelligence reported minimal resistance. The road to Caen appeared open. Cranley's orders were simple: advance through Villiers-Bocage, secure the high ground beyond, and prepare for the final push. The column moved with the confidence of veterans. These were men who had defeated the Afrika Korps, who had learned armoured warfare in the crucible of the Western Desert. They had faced Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs and prevailed. The morning seemed routine. Another French town, another advance, another step toward victory. What they didn't know, what British intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect, was that during the night, elements of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion had moved into positions around Villiers-Bocage. Among them was SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, a 30-year-old tank commander from Bavaria who had already destroyed 119 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front. He was the most lethal tank ace in the German army, and he was watching the British column roll into his kill zone. Wittmann sat in the commander's cupola of Tiger 205, a 56-ton Panzer VI Tiger I heavy tank, the most feared armoured vehicle in the world. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank from distances exceeding 2,000 metres. Its frontal armour, 100mm thick and sloped, was virtually impenetrable to British tank guns. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was a mobile fortress, a mechanical predator that had terrorised Soviet armour on the Russian steppes. And now 5 Tigers from Wittmann's company sat hidden in the bocage, the dense Norman hedgerows that turned every field into a natural ambush position. The British column had made a fatal error. In their confidence, they had stretched out along a single road, vehicles bunched together, minimal spacing between tanks. The lead elements had already passed through the town and were climbing toward Point 213, the high ground that dominated the area. The main body of the column, including Cranley's headquarters group, was strung along the main street of Villiers-Bocage. They had created a textbook ambush scenario. Vehicles trapped on a narrow road, unable to manoeuvre, unable to deploy, unable to bring their guns to bear in multiple directions. The kind of mistake that armoured commanders were taught to avoid on their first day of training. But these were veteran troops who had spent 2 years fighting in the open desert where visibility extended for miles. The claustrophobic terrain of Normandy, where sightlines were measured in metres and every hedgerow concealed potential death, was utterly foreign to their experience. Wittmann made his decision instantly. His Tiger was positioned in a sunken lane that paralleled the main road, concealed by thick hedgerows. His crew, veterans who had served with him since Russia, needed no detailed orders. They had done this before, many times: driver Balthazar Wall, gunner Bobby Wall, loader Karl Wagner, radio operator Herbert Foll. Together they were the most efficient killing machine in the German army. At 8:37 hours, Wittmann's Tiger crashed through the hedgerow and emerged onto the road behind the British column. The surprise was total and catastrophic. The first British vehicle to die was a Cromwell tank of A Squadron. The commander, looking forward toward the town, never saw the Tiger. Wittmann's gunner, Bobby Wall, one of the finest tank gunners in the Wehrmacht, didn't need orders. The 88mm gun spoke once. The armour-piercing round, travelling at 2,600 feet per second, struck the Cromwell's rear armour at point-blank range. The British tank's fuel tanks exploded instantly, turning the vehicle into a fireball. The crew had no time to react, no time to escape. They died without knowing what hit them. 9 seconds later, the Tiger fired again. Another Cromwell exploded, then another. Wittmann was firing on the move. his Tiger rolling forward at 15 miles per hour, Bobby Wall traversing the turret with mechanical precision, Carl Wagner ramming shells into the breach with practiced efficiency. The British column erupted in chaos. Tank commanders who seconds earlier had been relaxed, smoking cigarettes, scanning the peaceful Norman countryside, suddenly found themselves in a nightmare. A Tiger tank, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal, was among them, firing at point-blank range. The Cromwell tanks, armed with 75mm guns, couldn't penetrate the Tiger's frontal armour even at close range. Their only hope was to manoeuvre, to get to the Tiger's flanks or rear where the armour was thinner. But there was no room to manoeuvre. The narrow street, lined with stone buildings, was a killing corridor. Tanks trying to turn blocked other tanks. Half-tracks and trucks caught in the melee burst into flames as 88mm shells passed through them like paper. British tank crews, trained and experienced, tried desperately to fight back. Cromwell commander Lieutenant Bill Cotton managed to traverse his turret and fire at the advancing Tiger. His 75mm shell struck the Tiger's frontal armour and ricocheted harmlessly into the sky, the impact visible as a bright spark but causing no damage. The Tiger's return fire was not harmless. Bobby Wall put an 88mm round through Cotton's tank at a range of 80 metres. The penetration was so violent that the turret was blown completely off the hull, landing 15 feet away. The destruction of the British column took less than 5 minutes. Wittmann's single Tiger rolled through Villiers-Bocage like an avenging angel, firing methodically, destroying everything that moved. The 88mm gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, proved devastatingly effective against armour. Each shot was a kill. No second rounds were needed. The British tankers, veterans of North Africa, had never experienced anything like this. In the desert, tank battles were fought at long range, with time to manoeuvre, time to deploy, time to coordinate. This was slaughter at point-blank range, mechanical execution carried out with Prussian efficiency. Captain Pat Dias, commanding a troop of Cromwells near the rear of the column, watched in horror as Wittmann's Tiger demolished the vehicles ahead of him. He tried to back up, to gain manoeuvring room, but collided with a half-track behind him. His gunner fired at the Tiger, the shell striking the German tank's mantlet and bouncing off. The Tiger's turret swiveled toward Dias with terrifying speed. Bobby Wall had already loaded the next round. The 88 spoke again. Dias and his crew bailed out seconds before their tank exploded. By 43 hours, 6 minutes after Wittmann began his attack, 12 British vehicles were burning in the streets of Villiers-Bocage. The town's main street was choked with destroyed tanks, burning half-tracks, and dead British soldiers. The neat column that had rolled confidently into town was now a funeral pyre. Black smoke rose into the summer sky, visible for miles. But Wittmann wasn't finished. His ammunition rack still held rounds, his engine was running perfectly, and his tactical situation was favourable. Radio reports indicated that more British tanks had moved beyond the town to Point 213. Wittmann decided to pursue. It was an audacious decision, bordering on reckless. A single tank moving alone deep into enemy territory violated every principle of armoured warfare. But Wittmann understood something about psychological warfare. He knew that a single Tiger, appearing where it was impossible, where it shouldn't be, could create a panic disproportionate to its actual tactical significance. The Tiger rolled out of Villiers-Bocage, heading east on the Caen road. The massive tank moved with surprising grace for its 56-ton bulk, the Maybach HL 230 engine producing a distinctive deep rumble that British troops would come to recognise and fear. On Point 213, elements of 4th County of London Yeomanry had deployed in a defensive position, waiting for the rest of the column to catch up. They had heard the firing in the town but hadn't grasped the magnitude of the disaster. Radio communications were confused, contradictory. Some reports spoke of German tanks plural, some mentioned a single vehicle. The situation was unclear. Lieutenant Colonel Cranley had been killed in the initial attack, his command tank destroyed by Wittmann's second shot. The British force on Point 213, now isolated and leaderless, was trying to understand what was happening. Then they saw it. A single Tiger tank appearing on the road below them, advancing at speed. The sight was almost incomprehensible. One German tank, alone, moving toward an entire British armoured formation. It seemed suicidal. The British had numerous anti-tank guns in position, including 6-pounder guns that could penetrate a Tiger's side armour. They had tanks in hull-down positions with clear fields of fire. They had every advantage except one. They were facing Michael Wittmann. The Tiger didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. It rolled directly toward the British positions at 25 miles per hour, its 88mm gun traversing to acquire targets. The psychological impact was immediate. British tank commanders, already shaken by radio reports from the town, saw this lone Tiger advancing and made a fatal assumption. If one Tiger was attacking so boldly, there must be others. This must be the lead element of a major German counterattack. Panic is contagious in combat. When the first Cromwell on point 213 began reversing away from the Tiger, others followed. Within seconds, the British position that should have easily destroyed a single isolated tank was abandoning its ground. Wittmann's gunner opened fire at 200 metres, an extreme range for tank combat. The first shot missed, striking the ground in front of a Cromwell. The second shot didn't miss. A British Cromwell, attempting to turn and retreat, was struck in the side armour. The tank exploded, blocking the road for other vehicles trying to escape. The British force on point 213 disintegrated. Tanks that should have stood and fought instead fled. Anti-tank guns were abandoned. In their haste to escape the imagined German counterattack, British vehicles collided through tracks and created a traffic jam that made them sitting ducks for Wittmann's methodical gunnery. In 10 minutes, Wittmann destroyed 4 more British tanks and 3 half-tracks on point 2 and 13. His single Tiger had routed an entire armoured company. The statistical improbability of what was happening didn't matter. Reality was that one German tank commander was systematically destroying a British armoured column, but even Wittmann's luck had limits. As his Tiger pursued fleeing British vehicles down the reverse slope of point 213, he finally encountered organised resistance. A British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, emplaced in a concealed position and crewed by men with steady nerves, fired at the Tiger's side armour at 400 metres. The shot penetrated the Tiger's track and road wheels, immobilising the massive tank. For the first time that morning, Wittmann's Tiger was vulnerable. An immobilised tank is a dead tank. Without mobility, the Tiger couldn't manoeuvre to protect its weaker side and rear armour. British forces that moments earlier had been fleeing now had a stationary target. But the Tiger's 88mm gun still worked. Bobby Wall continued firing, destroying the anti-tank gun that had immobilised them and 2 more British vehicles that tried to manoeuvre for killing shots. The immobilised Tiger, turret still traversing, gun still firing, kept British forces at bay for 15 minutes. Finally, Wittmann made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered his crew to abandon the Tiger. They set demolition charges, destroying the tank's gun and fire control systems, and escaped on foot through the Bocage. They moved through hedgerows and ditches, evading British patrols, and reached German lines 6 hours later. Behind them, the Tiger sat silent, guns disabled, tracks broken, a monument to what one tank and one crew could achieve against impossible odds. But the story of Villiers-Bocage wasn't over. While Wittmann's lone Tiger had been creating havoc, the rest of his company had been moving into position. 4 more Tigers, plus supporting Panzer Mark IVs, had deployed around the town. The German tanks, operating in the Bocage terrain they understood, created an impenetrable barrier. The British 7th Armoured Division, attempting to relieve their trapped forces in Villiers-Bocage, ran into these positions throughout the day. Every attempt to push through was met with 88mm fire from concealed positions. British Cromwell and Sherman tanks were destroyed at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. By noon, the British situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. The forces in Villiers-Bocage were cut off and taking casualties from German infantry that had infiltrated the town. The relief columns were stalled, unable to break through the Tiger screen. The entire Operation Perch, the flanking manoeuvre that was supposed to capture Caen, was collapsing. Brigadier Hind, commanding the 22nd Armoured Brigade, faced an agonising decision. His forces in Villiers-Bocage were trapped in a salient, exposed to attack from 3 sides. German reinforcements were arriving. Intelligence reported that elements of the Panzer Lehr Division and additional SS units were moving to seal off the British penetration. Hind ordered a withdrawal. The forces in Villiers-Bocage would pull back to defensive positions west of the town. Operation Perch was cancelled. The British retreat took place throughout the afternoon of June 13th under constant German pressure. Tigers appeared wherever British forces tried to form defensive lines, their 88mm guns destroying British armour with impunity. The Sherman Fireflies, British tanks equipped with 17-pounder guns capable of penetrating Tiger armour, were too few to make a difference. By evening, British forces had withdrawn to positions near Amet-sur-Soule, 6 kilometres west of Villiers-Bocage. They left behind 27 tanks, 14 half-tracks, 14 Bren gun carriers, and over 200 casualties. The 7th Armoured Division, one of Britain's most elite formations, had been stopped cold by a force 1/10 its size. The tactical situation was clear. A single Tiger tank commanded by one man had initiated a chain of events that destroyed a British armoured column, killed or wounded over 200 British soldiers, destroyed or damaged nearly 60 vehicles, stopped a major British offensive, and delayed the capture of Caen by 6 weeks. The psychological impact was even more profound. British tankers, who had defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps, who considered themselves the masters of mobile warfare, had been traumatised by the Tigers. After Villiers-Bocage, British tank crews developed what commanders called Tiger fever, a psychological condition where the mere report of a Tiger in the area caused panic and defensive behaviour. American forces fighting in Normandy experienced the same phenomenon. Tank commanders who showed courage against German Mark IVs and Panthers became cautious and hesitant when Tigers were reported. The Tiger's reputation had grown beyond its actual capabilities. It was now a legend, a symbol of German technical superiority and tactical excellence. The reality was more complex. The Tiger I was indeed a formidable weapon. Its 88mm KWK 36L56 gun could penetrate 100mm of armour at 2,000 metres, more than enough to defeat any Allied tank. Its own armour, 100mm on the front and 80mm on the sides, made it nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. The Tiger's weaknesses were significant but often overlooked. It was mechanically unreliable. The Maybach engine was temperamental and prone to overheating. The overlapping road wheel system, while providing excellent cross-country performance, was a maintenance nightmare that frequently broke down. The Tiger consumed fuel at an enormous rate, 2 gallons per mile under combat conditions. Its combat range was barely 60 miles before refuelling was required. Most critically, Tigers were rare. Germany produced only 1,347 Tiger Is during the entire war, compared to over 50,000 American Shermans. A Tiger battalion at full strength had only 45 tanks. Most battalions operated at half that strength due to mechanical breakdowns and battle losses. But at Villiers-Bocage, none of these weaknesses mattered. What mattered was that Michael Wittmann, in a single tank, had achieved what German commanders had thought impossible, stopping a major Allied offensive with minimal forces. The German High Command recognised the propaganda value immediately. Wittmann was awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest decorations. German newsreels showed footage of destroyed British tanks in Villiers-Bocage, carefully edited to suggest massive German forces had defeated a British attack. The truth, that one tank had caused the destruction, was carefully omitted. Revealing that would expose how weak German forces in Normandy actually were. Michael Wittmann became a celebrity in Germany. His photograph appeared in newspapers and magazines. He was featured in propaganda broadcasts. Teenage boys joined the SS hoping to serve in Tiger battalions. The myth of the invincible Tiger and its invincible commanders was carefully cultivated by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. The British, meanwhile, tried to learn from their disaster. After-action reports identified multiple failures that had contributed to the catastrophe. The column had advanced without proper reconnaissance. They had bunched vehicles together instead of maintaining proper spacing. They had failed to secure the flanks and hedgerows before advancing through the town. They had underestimated German capabilities and overestimated their own intelligence. Most fundamentally, they had misunderstood the Norman terrain. The Bocage, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, was perfect defensive country. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow concealed a potential ambush. The open desert tactics that had worked in North Africa were worse than useless in Normandy. They were suicidal. British armour doctrine was revised. New tactical instructions emphasised dispersion, reconnaissance, and combined arms operations. Tanks would not advance without infantry support. Artillery would saturate suspected German positions before tanks moved forward. Air power would be called in at the first sign of Tigers. But these tactical reforms couldn't change the underlying reality. The Tiger was simply a better tank than anything the British had. The Cromwell, despite being fast and mechanically reliable, was undergunned and under-armoured. The Sherman, reliable and available in huge numbers, was a death trap when facing Tigers. Only the Sherman Firefly with its 17-pounder gun could reliably penetrate Tiger armour, and there were never enough Fireflies to go around. British tank crews understood the mathematics of their situation. In a one-on-one duel with a Tiger, they would lose. Their only hope was to overwhelm German tanks with numbers, to accept casualties as the price of victory. It was a brutal calculation that turned tank warfare into attritional warfare. The psychological burden on British tankers was enormous. They climbed into their Shermans and Cromwells knowing they were driving into battle in inferior machines. They knew that if they encountered a Tiger, their 75mm guns would bounce off its armour, while its 88 would punch through theirs like tissue paper. They fought anyway because that was their duty, but the knowledge that they were mechanically outmatched by their enemies ate at morale. American tankers in Normandy faced the same problem and developed the same psychological response. After their first encounters with Tigers, American tank crews became cautious to the point of timidity. Reports of Tigers, even unconfirmed rumours, would cause entire tank companies to halt and call for air support or artillery. Many reports of Tigers were actually encounters with Panzer Mark IVs or Panthers, but American crews reported every German tank as a Tiger. The actual numbers told a different story. Of approximately 200 Tiger tanks deployed in Normandy, only about 120 were operational at any time. They faced over 3,000 Allied tanks. The Tigers achieved impressive kill ratios, typically destroying 5 to 10 Allied tanks for every Tiger lost, but they were simply too few to affect the strategic situation. What the Tigers did accomplish was delaying the Allied advance and inflicting disproportionate casualties. Every day that British and American forces were stopped by Tiger screens was another day German infantry could dig in, another day reinforcements could arrive, another day the Atlantic Wall's fortifications could be strengthened. The Tigers at Villiers-Bocage had bought time. The delay in capturing Caen, caused directly by Wittmann's attack, had strategic consequences. Caen was a road hub controlling movement throughout the British sector. Without Caen, British forces were channeled into narrow frontages where German defenders could concentrate their limited forces. The city should have fallen in the first days of the invasion. Instead, it held out for 6 weeks, during which tens of thousands of British and Canadian soldiers became casualties in brutal attritional battles. Montgomery's plan for a rapid breakout from the beaches, a sweeping armoured thrust that would encircle German forces, never materialised. Instead, the Normandy campaign became the grinding attritional struggle that Allied planners had hoped to avoid. Some historians argue that Wittmann's single tank attack had changed the course of the Normandy campaign. Others suggest the impact was tactical rather than strategic, that Caen would have been difficult to capture regardless. What's undeniable is that the psychological impact of Villiers-Bocage affected Allied operations for the rest of the campaign. Michael Wittmann didn't survive long enough to see how his legend grew. On August 8, 1944, less than 2 months after Villiers-Bocage, he was killed in action near the town of Gourmenil during Operation Totalis. The exact circumstances of his death remain controversial. British accounts credit a Sherman Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry with destroying Wittmann's Tiger. Canadian accounts claim a Royal Canadian Air Force Typhoon fighter bomber fired rockets that killed him. German survivors suggest he was hit by multiple attackers simultaneously, and it's impossible to determine who delivered the fatal blow. What's certain is that Tiger 07, Wittmann's tank, was found burned out with all crew dead inside. The man who had terrified Allied tank crews, who had single-handedly stopped a British armoured division, who had become the most famous tank commander in the world, died at age 30 in a burned-out tank in a French field. He was buried initially in an unmarked grave, his body not formally identified until 1983. When his remains were discovered during road construction, they were reburied with full military honours in the German War Cemetery at Le Camp in Normandy. The grave marker lists his name, rank, dates of service, and nothing else. No mention of his victories, his decorations, or his fame. Just another German soldier among the 21,000 buried there. But the Tiger tanks he commanded and the battle at Villiers-Bocage remain subjects of fascination. The engagement has been analysed in military academies around the world as a case study in tactical audacity, aggressive action, and the decisive impact a single weapon system can have under the right circumstances. The lessons of Villiers-Bocage are complex and sometimes contradictory. On one level, it demonstrates the value of superior equipment and training. Wittmann's Tiger was mechanically superior to British tanks, and his crew's skill was exceptional. But equipment and training aren't sufficient explanations. The British tankers were also well trained and experienced. What made the difference was audacity. Wittmann's decision to attack alone, to pursue isolated enemy forces, to press his advantage ruthlessly despite being outnumbered 20-1, was tactically unsound according to conventional military doctrine. A single tank should not advance alone into enemy territory. It violates the principle of combined arms warfare. It leaves the tank vulnerable to flanking attacks, infantry ambushes, and airstrikes. But Wittmann understood that in the chaos of combat, psychological factors often outweigh tactical considerations. His appearance, where he shouldn't be, doing what shouldn't be possible, created panic that turned a British advantage into a rout. Modern military analysts studying Villiers-Bocage note that Wittmann succeeded because he violated his enemy's assumptions. British commanders assumed German forces were weak and demoralised after D-Day. They assumed the road to Caen was open. They assumed their own superiority after defeating Rommel in Africa. Wittmann shattered all those assumptions in 5 minutes. The battle also demonstrates the danger of overconfidence. The 7th Armoured Division had advanced into Villiers-Bocage without proper reconnaissance because they didn't believe German forces were nearby. They had bunched their vehicles because they didn't expect resistance. They had failed to secure the Bocage because they thought the area was clear. Every one of these assumptions was wrong, and British soldiers paid with their lives for their commanders' overconfidence. For modern tank commanders, Villiers-Bocage is taught as an example of terrain exploitation. The Bocage, which British tankers found claustrophobic and confusing, was ideal defensive ground for German forces who understood it. Hedgerows provided concealment for movement and ambush positions. Sunken lanes allowed tanks to move unseen parallel to roads. Stone buildings created urban terrain that favoured defenders. Wittmann used all these advantages perfectly. He approached through a sunken lane that hid his Tiger until the moment of attack. He used buildings for cover when repositioning. He exploited choke points to trap British vehicles. His understanding of terrain turned a 56-ton tank into an invisible predator. The battle is also studied as an example of the limitations of armour without combined arms support. The British column that entered Villiers-Bocage consisted almost entirely of tanks and armoured vehicles. There was minimal infantry support, no reconnaissance elements screening the flanks, and no artillery support immediately available. When they were ambushed, they had no infantry to clear buildings, no scouts to locate the ambushing tank, and no indirect fire to suppress enemy positions. They were pure armour attempting to operate independently, and they paid the price. German doctrine, even in 1944 when resources were scarce, emphasised combined arms operations. Tigers typically operated with infantry support, anti-aircraft vehicles to protect against air attack, and artillery on call. At Villiers-Bocage, the Tiger succeeded partly because British forces couldn't bring their full combined arms capability to bear in the confused close-range fighting. The most controversial aspect of Villiers-Bocage is its strategic significance. Some historians argue it was a minor tactical engagement that has been inflated by German propaganda and post-war mythology. They point out that British forces eventually captured Caen, that the delay of 6 weeks didn't significantly affect the war's outcome, and that glorifying Wittmann's action perpetuates the myth of German tactical superiority. Other historians argue that the delay in capturing Caen had profound strategic consequences. The 6 weeks of attritional fighting around the city consumed resources and manpower that could have been used for the breakout into France. The need to defeat concentrated German armour in Normandy prevented the rapid exploitation that could have ended the war months earlier. Every day the Normandy campaign continued was another day for Germany to prepare defences further east. What's undeniable is the battle's psychological impact. After Villiers-Bocage, Allied tank crews fought with the knowledge that German armour was superior. This affected tactical decisions, operational planning, and individual behaviour in combat. British and American tankers became more cautious, more dependent on artillery and air support, less willing to engage German tanks without overwhelming advantage. This caution probably saved lives, but also slowed the Allied advance. The Tiger's psychological impact exceeded its tactical capabilities. There were never enough Tigers to hold the line, but the fear of Tigers affected Allied operations far beyond where Tigers actually were. American and British commanders planned operations assuming Tigers were present even when intelligence indicated otherwise. Artillery barrages were called in on suspected Tiger positions. Airstrikes were diverted to hunt Tigers. Enormous resources were devoted to countering a weapon system that was relatively rare. From a production standpoint, the Tiger was Germany's most cost-effective weapon. Each Tiger cost approximately 250,000 Reichsmarks to produce and required 300,000 man-hours of labour. A Sherman cost $50,000 and required far less skilled labour. Germany produced 1,147 Tigers during the entire war. America produced 49,234 Shermans. The production ratio was 37-1 in favour of the Allies. But the Tigers achieved kill ratios that partially offset the production disparity. A Tiger that destroyed 10 Allied tanks before being knocked out had achieved a better than 3-to-1 cost-exchange ratio. When psychological impact is factored in, the Tiger's deterrent value, the resources Allied forces devoted to hunting them, the operations delayed or cancelled because of Tiger fears, the cost-effectiveness increases dramatically. But ultimately, cost-effectiveness doesn't win wars when your enemy has effectively unlimited resources. Germany could build the best tanks in the world and still lose because America could build 40 adequate tanks for every German excellent tank. The mathematics of industrial warfare were inescapable. After the war, Allied intelligence teams interrogated surviving Tiger commanders and crews to understand their tactics and techniques. The reports revealed that successful Tiger commanders shared certain characteristics. They were aggressive, seeking combat rather than waiting for it. They understood terrain and used it to offset numerical disadvantages. They had exceptional situational awareness, constantly analysing the tactical situation and exploiting enemy mistakes. Most importantly, they had superbly trained crews who could execute complex manoeuvres without detailed orders. Michael Wittmann's crew at Villiers-Bocage had worked together for months. His gunner Bobby Wall could identify target types instantly and knew exactly where to aim for maximum effect. His driver, Balthazar Wall, could manoeuvre the 56-ton Tiger through tight spaces with precision. His loader Karl Wagner could maintain a rate of fire that kept the 88mm gun speaking steadily. They were a team, operating with the coordination that only comes from shared combat experience. The same Allied intelligence reports noted that by late 1944, German Tiger crews were less effective. The veterans who had made the Tiger terrifying were mostly dead. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training, lacked the skill to fully exploit the Tiger's capabilities. Tigers in late 1944 and 1945 were frequently destroyed without achieving the kill ratios that earlier crews had managed. The weapon system was still formidable, but the human element had degraded. This pattern, excellent equipment operated by inadequately trained crews, characterized Germany's military situation in the war's final year. They still had Tigers and Panthers and other advanced weapons, but they lacked the fuel to train crews properly, the time to develop tactical proficiency, and the experienced instructors who had been killed on the Eastern and Western fronts. American and British forces in late 1944 faced numerous Tigers, but found them less terrifying than earlier encounters. Allied tank crews had learned tactics to counter Tigers. They used artillery and air support more effectively. They learned to maneuver in teams, using some tanks to distract the Tiger while others flanked it. They became more aggressive when they spotted Tigers, recognizing that hesitation allowed German tanks to dominate the engagement. Most importantly, Allied forces learned that Tigers, while dangerous, weren't invincible. At Villiers-Bocage, the psychological shock of encountering a Tiger had caused British forces to panic. By the fall of 1944, Allied tankers knew that Tigers could be destroyed. They had seen Tigers burn. They had developed confidence that even though their Shermans and Cromwells were inferior tank for tank, numerical superiority and proper tactics could prevail. The Battle of Villiers-Bocage, when analysed objectively, demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of tactical excellence. One tank commander with a superior weapon system and exceptional skill achieved a remarkable tactical success. He destroyed 27 British vehicles, killed over 200 enemy soldiers, and stopped a major offensive. But his success didn't change the strategic situation. British forces regrouped, brought up reinforcements, and eventually achieved their objectives. The delay of 6 weeks was significant but not decisive. Germany still lost the Normandy campaign, still lost France, still lost the war. The Tiger tanks that performed brilliantly at Villiers-Bocage were almost all destroyed in the subsequent fighting. The skilled crews that made the Tigers effective were killed or captured. The tactical victories achieved by German armour in Normandy couldn't compensate for the strategic reality of Allied material superiority. In the end, Villiers-Bocage stands as a memorial to tactical audacity and the decisive impact that individual skill and courage can have in combat. It demonstrates that under specific circumstances, one man in one tank can defeat an entire armoured column. But it also demonstrates the limitations of tactical success when the strategic situation is hopeless. Michael Wittmann's fame rests on a 5-minute engagement where his audacity and skill achieved the impossible. But he died 2 months later, his Tiger destroyed, his legend growing while Germany crumbled. The town of Villiers-Bocage was eventually liberated by British forces in August 1944. The destroyed British tanks were recovered, the damaged buildings were repaired, and life slowly returned to normal. But on June 13, 1944, for 5 terrifying minutes, that Norman town witnessed the perfect convergence of superior equipment, exceptional training, tactical audacity, and enemy mistakes that allowed one Tiger tank to achieve immortality. The mythology that grew around Villiers-Bocage in the decades after the war sometimes obscures the human reality of what happened that morning. For the British soldiers who died in their tanks, there was no glory, no tactical lesson, just sudden violence and death. Crews burned alive in vehicles that became steel coffins. Men were killed by metal fragments travelling at supersonic speeds through armour that was supposed to protect them. The wounded suffered from burns, shrapnel wounds, and traumatic amputations. The survivors carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Captain Pat Dias, who escaped from his burning Cromwell, spent weeks in field hospitals being treated for burns and shrapnel wounds. He returned to duty in August 1944 but was never again comfortable in a tank. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he described recurring nightmares about the sound of the 88mm gun, a distinctive crack followed by the metallic scream of armour being penetrated. He said he could still hear it decades later, still felt the heat of his burning tank, still saw his crew chief's face in the moment before the explosion. The psychological trauma wasn't limited to those directly involved. News of the disaster spread rapidly through British armoured units in Normandy. Tank crews who hadn't been at Villiers-Bocage heard the stories, heard about the single Tiger that destroyed an entire column, heard about how quickly it happened and how helpless the victims had been. The impact on morale was significant and long-lasting. After action reports from British units in late June and July 1944 consistently mention reduced aggressiveness in armoured operations. Tank commanders who previously would have pushed forward aggressively now waited for infantry and artillery support. Reconnaissance elements became overcautious, reporting German armour even when only infantry was present. The operational tempo of British armoured formations slowed noticeably. Montgomery's staff recognised the problem and attempted to address it through leadership changes and tactical reforms. Units that showed excessive caution had their commanders replaced. New tactical doctrines emphasised combined arms coordination and overwhelming firepower before tank advances. But the fundamental problem remained. British tankers knew their equipment was inferior, and no amount of tactical reform could change that reality. The Americans faced similar challenges but responded differently. American doctrine had always emphasized material superiority and firepower over tactical elegance. When American tankers discovered their Shermans were inferior to German tanks, the response was to build more Shermans, bring up more artillery, call in more airstrikes, and overwhelm German positions through sheer weight of resources. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armoured Division, documented the American approach in his memoir. He described recovering destroyed Shermans, often with dead crews still inside, repairing the tanks and sending them back into action within days. The tanks that had been death traps for their previous crews were refurbished and assigned to replacement crews who understood they were climbing into vehicles that had already killed Americans. They went anyway because that was the job, because America could replace tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, and because eventually, through sheer attrition, the numbers would tell. The American approach was brutal and effective. It accepted casualties as the price of victory and relied on industrial capacity to replace losses. A Sherman crew that encountered a Tiger had poor odds of survival, but there were always more Shermans, more crews, and eventually the Tigers ran out of ammunition or fuel or broke down or were overwhelmed by numbers. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable. German tankers understood this reality with growing despair. Otto Carius, another Tiger ace who survived the war, wrote in his memoir about the psychological burden of knowing that every destroyed enemy tank would be replaced, while German losses were permanent. He described the feeling of fighting a defensive battle, where the enemy's resources were infinite and German resources were exhausted. Every day brought more Allied tanks, more Allied aircraft, more Allied artillery. The Tigers could achieve impressive kill ratios, but the killing never stopped because the targets never ran out. The Bocage terrain of Normandy provided some advantages for German defenders. The close terrain limited the effectiveness of Allied numerical superiority and air power. A Tiger positioned in a hedgerow-covered ambush position could destroy multiple enemy tanks before being located. German infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets could destroy Allied tanks at close range. The terrain turned Normandy into a defensive fortress, where every field had to be fought for and every hedgerow concealed potential death. But terrain advantages couldn't compensate for Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. The fuel shortages that plagued German forces in Normandy meant that Tigers often couldn't move to where they were needed. Mechanical breakdowns that would have been minor problems with adequate spare parts and maintenance facilities became mission kills. A Tiger with a thrown track or an overheated engine was useless, a 56-ton paperweight occupying a defensive position but unable to maneuver. The Allies learned to exploit these German weaknesses. Allied air power, initially frustrated by the Bocage's limited visibility, adapted by attacking German supply lines and fuel depots. Tigers that couldn't move because they lacked fuel could be bypassed or destroyed by artillery. The German advantage in tank quality was systematically neutralized by Allied attacks on the logistical infrastructure that kept German tanks running. Wittmann's success at Villiers-Bocage represented the high watermark of German tactical effectiveness in Normandy. It demonstrated what was possible when a skilled crew in a superior tank encountered an enemy making tactical errors. But it also represented a type of warfare that Germany could no longer sustain. The individual heroics of ace tank commanders couldn't compensate for Germany's collapsing industrial capacity, fuel shortages, and manpower crisis. By August 1944, when Wittmann was killed, the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion that had been so effective in June was a shadow of its former strength. Of the 45 Tigers the battalion had deployed to Normandy, fewer than 10 remained operational. The rest had been destroyed in combat, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or lost when their crews ran out of fuel and were forced to demolish them to prevent capture. The skilled crews that had made the Tigers effective were mostly dead or wounded. Their replacements, young men with minimal training, couldn't achieve the same results. The Battle of the Villiers-Bocage in August 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of fortune from Villiers-Bocage. German forces, including the remnants of the Tiger battalions, were surrounded by Allied forces and systematically destroyed. The Tigers that had terrorized Allied tank crews in June were hunted down and eliminated by coordinated attacks involving artillery, air power, and massed tank formations. The Bocage terrain that had favoured defenders became a trap when Allied forces closed the pocket from all sides. German attempts to break out of the Villiers-Bocage resulted in the destruction of most remaining German armour in Normandy. Tigers that had survived months of combat were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Crews that had achieved remarkable kill ratios were killed or captured when overwhelming Allied forces overran their positions. The tactical excellence that had made German armour feared couldn't overcome strategic encirclement and resource exhaustion. The young tankers who replaced veterans like Wittmann faced an impossible situation. They were expected to achieve the same results with less training, worse mechanical reliability due to spare parts shortages, and against an enemy that had learned from earlier mistakes. American and British forces in August 1944 no longer made the tactical errors that had led to disasters like Villiers-Bocage. They advanced with proper reconnaissance, maintained combined arms coordination, and called in overwhelming firepower before committing armour. Learning curve in armoured warfare had tilted decisively in favour of the Allies. British and American tank crews who had been terrified of Tigers in June had learned that tigers could be destroyed through teamwork and proper tactics. They had learned to identify tigers by their distinctive sound and silhouette. They had learned to call for artillery and air support immediately rather than trying to fight tigers tank to tank. Most importantly, they had learned not to panic when tigers appeared, to maintain tactical cohesion and execute practiced counter-tactics. German training programs in late 1944 couldn't provide the experience that Allied tankers were gaining through continuous combat. A British tanker who survived June and July 1944 had learned more about fighting tigers than any classroom could teach. An American tanker who had faced German armour in multiple engagements understood how to identify weaknesses and exploit them. The Allies were developing institutional knowledge about how to fight German armour effectively, while German institutional knowledge was dying with the veterans. The mythology surrounding the tiger, and specifically the mythology surrounding Wittmann and Villiers-Bocage, served German propaganda purposes but didn't reflect the increasingly desperate reality of Germany's military situation. Goebbels' propaganda ministry continued to publish stories about tiger aces destroying dozens of enemy tanks, creating the impression that German armour remained dominant. The reality was that by late 1944, Germany was losing the war of attrition, and no amount of tactical excellence could change that outcome. Post-war analysis of the Tiger program reveals the fundamental mismatch between German design philosophy and wartime reality. The Tiger was an outstanding tank in terms of firepower, armour protection, and crew comfort. German engineers had created a technically superior weapon system that could dominate any Allied tank in direct combat. But the Tiger's complexity made it difficult to produce in large numbers, difficult to maintain in field conditions, and vulnerable to the fuel shortages that plagued German forces. American and British tanks were simpler, cheaper, and easier to maintain. A Sherman that broke down could often be repaired by its crew using basic tools. A Tiger that threw a track required specialized equipment and trained mechanics to repair, and the overlapping road wheel system meant that a single damaged wheel often required removing multiple other wheels to access it. In the mud and rain of Normandy, Tiger crews spent more time on maintenance than combat. The fuel consumption comparison was especially stark. A Tiger in combat consumed fuel at rates that would have been sustainable for Germany in 1941 but were impossible to maintain in 1944. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had devastated German fuel production. Synthetic fuel plants were priority targets for Allied bombers, and by mid-1944, Germany's fuel production had dropped to a fraction of wartime requirements. Tigers that should have been fighting were sitting immobile in defensive positions because there was no fuel to move them. The human cost of the Tiger program was also significant. Training a Tiger crew required months and extensive resources. The commanders who achieved ace status, men like Wittmann, Carius and others, had hundreds of hours of combat experience and had survived situations that killed most of their peers. When these veterans died, replacing them was impossible. Germany didn't have the fuel for extensive training, didn't have the time to develop experienced crews, and didn't have the institutional capacity to transfer knowledge from veterans to replacements. The Allies faced the same challenge of training replacement crews but solved it through different means. American training programs produced thousands of tank crews annually, each receiving standardized instruction that emphasized doctrine and teamwork over individual excellence. When an experienced Sherman crew was killed, their replacement crew had been trained to the same standards and could integrate into existing units rapidly. The quality of individual crews might be lower than German veterans, but the consistency and availability of replacements meant that Allied armoured units maintained their effectiveness. British training programs evolved similarly after Villiers-Bocage. The disaster had revealed deficiencies in tactical training and understanding of Bocage warfare. New training emphasised combined arms operations, proper spacing in tactical columns, the importance of reconnaissance, and specific tactics for engaging Tigers and other German heavy armour. British tank crews arriving in France in August 1944 were better prepared for the realities of fighting in Normandy than the veterans of the Desert Rats had been in June. The institutional learning that occurred within Allied forces contrasted sharply with Germany's deteriorating training infrastructure. German tank training schools in 1944 were under constant air attack, short of fuel, and lacking experienced instructors. Training that should have taken months was compressed into weeks. Replacement crews arrived at the front with minimal gunnery training, inadequate tactical instruction, and sometimes without ever having fired the main gun of their tank. The result was predictable. Tiger tanks operated by inexperienced crews achieved far lower kill ratios than the same tanks operated by veterans. A Tiger that should have been a war-winning weapon became just another tank when operated by a crew that didn't understand how to exploit its advantages. American after-action reports from late 1944 note numerous encounters where Tigers were destroyed by Sherman crews using tactics that would have been suicidal against veteran-operated Tigers, but worked against poorly trained crews. The technological response to the Tiger threat also evolved significantly. The British developed the Sherman Firefly, mounting a 17-pounder gun on a Sherman chassis. The 17-pounder could penetrate Tiger armour at combat ranges, finally giving British tankers a weapon that could fight Tigers on relatively equal terms. The Americans developed the M26 Pershing heavy tank with a 90mm gun and heavier armour. These weapons arrived too late and in too few numbers to significantly impact the Normandy campaign, but demonstrated that Allied industry could respond to German technical superiority when necessary. More significant than new tank designs was the evolution of combined arms tactics. Allied forces learned that the way to defeat Tigers wasn't through tank duels, but through coordinated attacks using artillery, air power, infantry, and armour in combination. A Tiger that was invulnerable to Allied tank guns could be destroyed by artillery fire, disabled by infantry with anti-tank weapons, or caught in the open by fighter bombers. The key was denying the Tiger the conditions where its advantages mattered. Fighter bombers, particularly the American P-47 Thunderbolt and British Typhoon, proved especially effective at disrupting German armoured operations. While rockets and bombs rarely achieved direct hits on tanks, the psychological impact of air attack was enormous. Tiger crews that could face Allied tanks with confidence became cautious and defensive when aircraft appeared overhead. The threat of air attack forced German armour to move only at night or in poor weather, surrendering the initiative to Allied forces. The systematic application of Allied air power transformed the tactical equation. A Tiger that dominated ground combat became vulnerable when it had to move, when it had to refuel, when it had to receive ammunition resupply. Allied pilots learned to attack German supply columns, fuel depots, and maintenance facilities rather than hunting individual tanks. By destroying the logistics infrastructure that supported German armour, Allied air power achieved strategic effects that tactical tank battles couldn't accomplish. The German response to Allied air superiority was to further restrict tank movements, operate more defensively, and rely increasingly on ambush tactics from concealed positions. These tactics extended the Normandy campaign and inflicted higher casualties on Allied forces than mobile operations would have, but they also surrendered the initiative and allowed Allied forces to choose when and where to attack. Villiers-Bocage, viewed in this larger context, represented a type of armoured warfare that was becoming obsolete even as it achieved spectacular success. Wittmann's Lone Tiger, achieving a remarkable tactical victory, looked impressive in isolation, but couldn't be replicated across the front. The conditions that allowed his success, enemy overconfidence, tactical mistakes, favourable terrain, surprise, were specific to that engagement and that moment. German forces couldn't create those conditions, systematically across multiple battlefields simultaneously. The lessons that Allied forces learned from Villiers-Bocage were applied throughout their armies within weeks. The lessons that could have been learned from German success, the value of aggressive action, the importance of combining quality and audacity, the psychological impact of unexpected attacks, couldn't be applied by German forces because they lacked the resources, training infrastructure, and strategic mobility to execute such tactics broadly. Modern military analysis of Villiers-Bocage focuses on several key points. First, the engagement demonstrates the continuing importance of individual initiative and leadership in tactical combat. Wittmann's decision to attack, made without orders and contrary to doctrine, created an opportunity that more cautious commanders would have missed. Second, the battle shows the decisive advantage of superior equipment when operated by skilled crews. The Tiger's technical superiority allowed it to achieve results that would have been impossible in an inferior vehicle. Third, the engagement reveals the critical importance of combined arms operations and the vulnerability of pure armour formations without infantry and artillery support. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the limitations of tactical success. Wittmann achieved everything that tactical excellence could accomplish. He surprised his enemy, exploited their mistakes, used superior equipment skillfully, and achieved a remarkable victory against vastly superior numbers. and it didn't matter strategically. The British regrouped, brought up reinforcements, adapted their tactics, and achieved their objectives. Germany's fuel ran out, the skilled crews died, the industrial base collapsed, and the Tigers became museum pieces and scrap metal. The romanticisation of Villiers-Bocage in post-war literature and media often misses this fundamental point. The engagement is portrayed as a brilliant tactical victory, which it was, but also implicitly as vindication of German military excellence and evidence that Germany could have won with better leadership or more resources or different strategic decisions. The reality is that Germany's strategic situation in June 1944 was hopeless. The Normandy invasion succeeded because Allied industrial might and manpower were overwhelming. Tactical excellence and superior equipment could delay defeat, but couldn't prevent it. The veterans of the engagement on both sides generally understood this reality better than the historians and enthusiasts who later studied the battle. British survivors acknowledged their tactical mistakes, but also noted that they learned from those mistakes and went on to liberate Europe. German survivors celebrated Wittmann's achievement, but also recognised that his death 2 months later, and the deaths of so many skilled tankers, represented the exhaustion of Germany's human capital. Otto Carius, the Tiger ace who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, was asked in the 1990s about the significance of battles like Villiers-Bocage. His response was characteristically blunt. "We won many tactical battles and lost the war. Every time we destroyed 10 enemy tanks, they built 20 more. Every skilled commander we lost was replaced by a teenager with no training. We were very good at fighting, but we were fighting for a regime that deserved to lose and against enemies with unlimited resources. Wittmann was an outstanding tank commander, but his victories didn't change the outcome. They just delayed the inevitable and got more young men killed." The British Veterans Associations and German veteran groups occasionally met in the decades after the war to remember and reconcile. These meetings, held in the same Norman towns where they had fought, had tried to kill each other, were often emotional. Men who'd been mortal enemies recognised each other as fellow soldiers who had survived terrible events. They remembered comrades who hadn't survived, acknowledged the courage that existed on both sides, and generally avoided discussing the political circumstances that had put them in combat against each other. At a 1994 meeting in Villiers-Bocage, marking the 50th anniversary of the battle, several British veterans of the 7th Armoured Division met with German veterans of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. They walked through the streets where the ambush had occurred, now peaceful and prosperous. They visited a small memorial that listed the names of soldiers from both sides who had died there. One British veteran, who had escaped from a burning Cromwell, shook hands with a German Tiger crewman who might have been shooting at him that day. The photograph of that handshake, two elderly men in civilian clothes standing before a memorial to their dead comrades, captures something that tactical analysis cannot: the human dimension of war and the possibility of reconciliation after even the most bitter conflict. The town of Villiers-Bocage itself bears few physical scars from the battle. The destroyed buildings were rebuilt, the streets were repaired, and life continued. Small plaques mark where specific events occurred. A larger memorial on the outskirts of town commemorates all the soldiers who fought there. The local museum contains artifacts from the battle, pieces of destroyed tanks, personal items from soldiers, photographs, and documents. It's visited by military historians, veterans' families, and tourists who want to understand what happened in this quiet Norman town in June 1944. The Tiger tank that Wittmann commanded at Villiers-Bocage, Tiger 205, was recovered by British forces and briefly examined before being scrapped for metal. No photographs of the specific vehicle are known to exist, though numerous photographs of similar Tigers provide a clear picture of what Wittmann's crew operated. The 88mm gun, the thick armour, the massive bulk, the mechanical complexity, all clearly visible in surviving examples displayed in museums around the world. Several Tiger tanks survive in museums and private collections. The most famous is Tiger 131, captured in Tunisia in 1943 and now displayed at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. This Tiger, the only fully operational Tiger in the world, is occasionally driven for demonstrations. The sound it makes, the deep rumble of the Maybach engine and the squeal of the tracks, is the same sound that terrified Allied tankers in Normandy. Visitors to Bovington who watch Tiger 131 drive can begin to understand the psychological impact of facing such a machine in combat. though the demonstration occurs in peaceful circumstances with no one shooting back. The technical analysis of the Tiger continues to fascinate engineers and military historians. The design represented German engineering at its peak, powerful, precise, complex, and ultimately impractical for mass production. The Tiger was an apex predator in armoured warfare, but apex predators require specific ecological niches to survive. When the niche disappeared, when fuel ran out, when spare parts couldn't be manufactured, when skilled crews were killed, the Tiger became extinct. Modern tank design has moved away from the Tiger's philosophy of maximum individual capability toward designs that balance capability with producibility, maintainability, and logistics. The American M1 Abrams tank, introduced in 1980, was designed specifically to be supportable in field conditions, with power pack modules that could be swapped rapidly and systems that could be maintained by relatively unskilled mechanics. The lesson learned from World War II was that tank availability and sustainability matter more than maximum capability. The tactical lessons of Villiers-Bocage remain relevant for modern armoured warfare. The importance of reconnaissance, the vulnerability of columns to ambush, the value of combined arms operations, the psychological impact of technological superiority, all these factors continue to influence military doctrine. Modern army training includes case studies of the engagement, though usually with emphasis on what the British did wrong rather than what Wittmann did right. The mythology and the reality of Villiers-Bocage have diverged significantly. The mythology presents a superhuman German tank commander single-handedly defeating an entire British armoured division through skill and courage. The reality is more complex and less cinematic, a skilled crew in a superior tank exploiting enemy mistakes and favourable circumstances to achieve a remarkable but ultimately insignificant tactical victory. The mythology serves the human need for heroes and dramatic narratives. The reality serves the historian's need for accurate understanding of what happened and why. Michael Wittmann remains one of the most famous tank commanders in military history, largely because of Villiers-Bocage. His name appears in countless books, articles, and documentaries about armoured warfare. He has been the subject of biographies, the inspiration for fictional characters, and a continuing topic of debate among military enthusiasts. The attention is deserved in the sense that his tactical achievement was remarkable. The attention is also problematic because it focuses on individual heroism rather than the systemic factors that determined the war's outcome. The men Wittmann killed at Villiers-Bocage were also brave, also skilled, also trying to do their duty. They died because they were in inferior equipment, because their commanders made tactical errors, because they were in the wrong place when a skilled enemy appeared. Their deaths contributed to Allied victory by teaching other British tankers what not to do, by forcing tactical reforms that saved other lives, by demonstrating that overconfidence kills. They deserve to be remembered as much as their killer, though they rarely receive equivalent attention. The Tiger tank, viewed objectively, was a magnificent failure. It was the best heavy tank of World War II in terms of battlefield capability. It was also a resource sink that Germany couldn't afford, a maintenance nightmare that limited its operational availability, and a symbol of German engineering priorities that favoured perfection over pragmatism. Building fewer, better tanks proved to be a losing strategy against an enemy building adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers. The final irony of Villiers-Bocage is that the battle's tactical success contributed to Germany's strategic failure. The resources devoted to Tiger production, the fuel consumed by Tigers in combat, the skilled crews who died operating Tigers, all these represented investments in a strategy that couldn't succeed. If Germany had built 3 Panzer Mark Vs for every Tiger, accepting lower individual capability in exchange for greater numbers, would the war have ended differently? Probably not, because Germany's fundamental problem was resource scarcity, not tank design. But the question illustrates the strategic trap that the Tiger represented. 80 years after Villiers-Bocage, the battle remains a subject of fascination because it represents war at its most dramatic. Individual courage, technological sophistication, tactical brilliance, and sudden violence combining in a brief engagement that had lasting consequences. The human need to find meaning in chaos, to identify heroes in horror, to extract lessons from catastrophe, all these psychological imperatives ensure that battles like Villiers-Bocage continue to be studied, debated, and remembered long after the participants have died, and the strategic context has faded. In the end, Villiers-Bocage stands as testament to a simple truth about warfare. Tactical excellence matters. Individual courage and skill can achieve remarkable results. Superior equipment, skillfully employed, provides decisive advantages, but wars are won by nations, not individuals. The Tiger tank and Michael Wittmann achieved everything that mettle and courage could accomplish. It wasn't enough. The British column that rolled into Villiers-Bocage on June 13, 1944 represented an industrial civilization with effectively unlimited resources engaged in total war. One tank destroying that column was spectacular, newsworthy, and ultimately meaningless. The British built more tanks, trained more crews, learned from their mistakes, and won the war. The Tiger ran out of fuel, the skilled crews died, and Germany surrendered. That's the real lesson of Villiers-Bocage, beneath the mythology and the hero worship and the technical analysis. In modern industrial warfare, logistics defeats tactics, resources defeat skill, and sustainability defeats perfection.